I'd like to start this evening with a recognition, a land recognition, and I'd like to acknowledge that this evening is actually the beginning of the Jewish holiday of Tu B'Shvat. So for those who don't know, Tu B'Shvat is the New Year of Trees, and I think it's appropriate to point out that we now sit with what was traditionally and still is a space called Kamkamale. I hope that I'm getting the pronunciation correct there. I've only heard it a couple times, and hopefully that changes soon, which is a Coast Salish word. Kamkamale roughly translates to the place of the big leafed maple trees. While the Jewish New Year of Trees has long been used by Israel in its effort to steal Palestinian land by planting trees where villages once stood, I hope we can instead honor this beautiful holiday by marking the place where the maples once stood, here on Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territory, where once these folks used this space as their summer area for fishing and gathering and for preserving as well. This land was obviously, to many of us, stolen, even though it is unceded territory, and we need to make that abundantly clear in all of our actions, especially when we're talking about Palestine. So let's just take a moment for that. You may have also noticed that this theater and cultural center is named after the company Goldcorp. Yes. Who's been to a show here before where it's been mentioned that Goldcorp is a company that does things that aren't great for the world? Okay, that's great. So I'm going to follow in that tradition. So Goldcorp, despite it having been acquired and absorbed by another company in 2019, has a long legacy that is dark. I'd be remiss if during this land recognition I didn't also acknowledge the ongoing harm and devastation of Goldcorp's mining operations on Indigenous people throughout the world. Goldcorp was part of Canada's neo-colonial and extractivist project, and still is to this day. Their operations have resulted in mass displacement and poor health for communities surrounding their mines, killing of activists, rampant environmental degradation, and the corruption of governments both at home and abroad. Shame. It's time for SFU to rename this place in the spirit of decolonization. And so now to say a few more words and to lead us to the film, here is Dr. Adel Iskander, who is the head of the Center for Comparative Muslim Studies here at SFU, which is a co-sponsor for tonight's event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Omri. Welcome, everyone. It's really inspiring to see such a large crowd. And for those of you who don't know, there's also an overspill room in Harbor Center that's also at or near capacity. So this is very exciting for an event of this sort. There's not much I can say beyond the fact that all of us are immensely grateful for independent Jewish voices and so many Jewish colleagues, friends, comrades who have stepped up and expressed solidarity during these very, very, very difficult times. Those colleagues are people who we know are having to, swim against the tide and do things against the grain, which in the spirit of the most fundamentally prophetic and Jewish tradition is immensely courageous and a testament to the legacy of so many remarkable Jewish intellectuals throughout time and history. So I just wanted to, acknowledge that. While we may have helped book the room, all the heavy lifting has been done largely by independent Jewish voices. And Kylie, yes, of course, from the Center for Comparative Muslim Studies, our unsung hero who doesn't like her name mentioned in these contexts. But nevertheless, Kylie, thank you for doing what you do. And so many volunteers. Thank you. Yes. disappears into the night. And so many volunteers who are here to help and support both in this location and at Harbor Centers. Center. I do want to say that a lot of the conversations that are being had about this subject matter are difficult. And we have to take a moment to stop and recognize how difficult they are. And they're difficult for everyone involved. And so the objective here is to not in any way negate anyone's tragedy and collective memory of trauma, but nevertheless to also tease open those wounds to understand how they can be an opportunity for learning, for growth, and for collective living, which is what this project is all about. I'm no Gabor Maté. You might be Naomi Klein, but I'm no Gabor Maté. You probably don't want to hear from me. And this film is really remarkable. I've heard a lot about it. I haven't seen it. But I want to leave you with the thought that so many people wanted and continue to want to see this film. It's being screened in 45, there are 45 screenings in 40 cities or the other way around, and proliferating remarkably. There are 5 screenings across the city in the coming days. If you like it, recommend it to others. Please tell people when these screenings are happening. This event is brought to you not only by Independent Jewish Voices, but also by numerous departments across the university. Of course, the SFU Van City for Community Engagement. I have to look at the logos to remember, but they're all cut off. The Labor Studies Program, the School for International Studies, the Institute for Humanities, and several others who have supported. So without further ado, I wish to leave you with Israelism and the subsequent conversation. Thank you all.
Yeah, it's now my pleasure to say that who these panelists are. Unfortunately, we're short on time, and so my introductions will be necessarily incomplete. However, the speakers tonight really need very little introduction, and many of us have been fans of theirs for years. So, in order of appearance in the film, we have Simone Zimmerman. Simone is an organizer and strategist based in New York City. She is a co-founder of the anti-apartheid organization, If Not Now, a leading Jewish group in the ceasefire movement. She is an emerging thought leader on the Jewish left, and I'll say a really profound person to witness in her element on screen. So we'll also welcome now Dr. Gabor Maté. Public speaker, best-selling author of 5 best-selling books. He also has received an Outstanding Alumnus Award from this very institution and was awarded with the Order of Canada.
I've sold a lot of hack politicians and bagmen, so no big deal.
Let's not applaud the Order of Canada, but the recognition of Dr. Maté. For 12 years, perhaps more importantly, Dr. Maté worked just a few blocks away in Vancouver's downtown east side with patients challenged by intense drug addiction, mental illness, and HIV, including at Vancouver's supervised injection site, North America's first of its kind. Another important note is that born in Hungary to Jewish parents, Dr. Maté is a survivor of the Nazi Holocaust and longtime critic of Israel's policies that harm Palestinians. He is a member of Independent Jewish Voices. Naomi Klein. Award-winning journalist, columnist, international best-selling author of 9 books, published in over 35 languages. No Logo, Shock Doctrine, This Changes Everything, No Is Not Enough, On Fire, and of course, Doppelganger. Her writing has appeared in leading publications around the world, and she's a columnist for The Guardian. She's an honorary professor at Rutgers, and of course, an associate professor of geography at UBC, and founding co-director of UBC's Center for Climate Justice. So thank you for welcoming our guests, and I hate to do this, but I'm going to start with you, Naomi, if you're able to give us your impressions of the film to start.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I feel really grateful to be in this space with all of you on these stolen lands, talking about stolen land. And I feel really grateful to be part of this really beautiful intergenerational conversation. Gabor has been speaking out for justice for Palestinians as a Holocaust survivor since as long as I can remember, had a huge influence on my coming out as a post-Zionist Jew. And, these have been such heartbreaking months when I think all of us have seen people who we had so respect for and who did really great work in different domains, moral work, suddenly excusing genocide, suddenly rationalizing bombing hospitals and schools, and just retreating into a kind of a trauma loop. And so I feel particular gratitude for Dr. Maté for your huge and unshaking moral leadership and consistency, and it's not something that we can take for granted. So I want to recognize that. And Simone, I feel so grateful to you, watching the leadership that you showed in building the moral Jewish youth-led movement that we have seen in the streets over these very, very dark months. It's been for me as a Jewish person, the single source of hope has been seeing, if not now, Jewish Voice for Peace, independent Jewish voices rise immediately, and go into this breach in the thousands, in the tens of thousands. And so, that doesn't come out of nowhere. That's the work of decades of often unseen work. And thank goodness that you invested in institution building. I feel so much gratitude. The end of this film, which is so necessary, to watch you change your mind. This is such a polarized moment, and I think particularly for young people, people feel expected to already be in the place, right? To already know everything. And so just to model learning, to model unlearning, to model uncertainty, that, as an educator, I can tell you there's nothing more important right now than for people to be able to be on that kind of journey with you. We need more stories like that, those types of stories where we see ourselves change, right? We're all prisoners of our own stories, and none of our stories are complete, right? We all need to be learning and be porous to one another's stories and tell new stories together that are more complete. That's the work of life, right? And we can get so locked into our own stories. So it's a very, very important thing that the work that this film is doing. And I also feel, to echo one of the voices from Breaking the Silence, one of the leaders of that remarkable organization who talked about the shame. I also feel shame, a lot of shame, and have felt a lot of shame in these months. And even being here tonight, because we are in a genocide, and there is a way that Jewish stories are taking up too much space. There is a way in which our talking, our traumas, our loops are not leaving space for Palestinian humanity still. So I think as we tease this apart, we have to hold that tension and that reality, and also think about when we do take up space, when we do speak in this moment, that it has to really be a process of reckoning with the way the stories that so many of us grew up with were stories that created a supremacy of trauma that did not allow us as Jews to recognize, to know the trauma of others, specifically the trauma of Palestinians. And that is impossible. I don't want any part of it, and I think that is, I was so struck in the film, just a more quick reaction, is just, these so-called leaders in the Jewish community whose entire work is the work of terrorizing the people they claim to represent. They want to keep Jewish people terrified. That is not leadership. That is the opposite of leadership. And there is a generational shift. You're a part of it. I'm so grateful for it. And part of this work now is just to simply say, nobody elected them. Much of there is no accountability for this leadership. They do not represent us. We refuse to be led through mechanisms of terror. And I just want that, I think the part of the weight of this film is knowing that it's from the before times, and that final lyrics, that was not the darkest hour. It can always get darker, and we are in a much, much darker moment right now, as we know. And it always can, right? It always can. And those images, I've never been so chilled by the images of Charlottesville. I was chilled the first many times I've seen it, but now we know they're on the march again. And we know that Trump is on his way back in. And we know that Israel is making alliances with Marine Le Pen in France, with Giorgia Meloni in Italy, with Viktor Orban in Hungary, with every fascist force in this country. That does not represent Jews. This is deadly serious. We have to liberate ourselves from this death machine. It's time.
Well, thank you, Naomi. I'm just reading a really good book. It's called Doppelganger by Naomi Klein. And when I read books, I always note down phrases that appeal to me. So I'd like to frame this initial remarks of mine somewhat around some phrases out of Naomi's book. She talks about open warfare against objective reality. That's what we're facing right now. Objective warfare against objective reality. She talks about, that's on page 5. On page 156, she talks about the normalization of the dissociation between words from reality. Now, yesterday, I took part in an online debate, you can find it on YouTube, with a rabbi, Volpe, L-O-P-E, who was a rabbi from Los Angeles and works at Harvard. And we had to be polite and civil, and I think I kept it together pretty well. But part of me wanted to grab him by the neck and say, "What the fuck are you talking about?" Because he was denying reality. It's illegal in this country to deny the Holocaust. It's not illegal to deny the Nakba. Now, if there was a law against history denial, then most Jewish professors in this country would be in jail because they deny reality. And most Jewish spokesmen, not only Jewish, by the way, all the other acolytes and opportunists and politicians, the hypocrisy is incredible. Ukraine, we bring in any number of Ukrainian refugees. They limited the number of Palestinian Gazan refugees to 1,000. And the comparison, you can't even compare the devastation between the two countries. You can't even compare it. I want to grab part of me, as much as we engage in civil discourse, I'm so enraged by what I see happening every day. Well, let's go on with Naomi's book. She talks about shock is the gap that opens up between the event and existing narratives to explain the event. It's a gap between the event and the existing narratives. Being creatures of narrative, she says, humans tend to be very uncomfortable with vacuums. What's happened right now, if there's anything to be gleaned that's positive from the current horror, is that a lot more people are waking up, is that the old narrative are no longer covering the reality. And there's a shock right now for a lot of people. A lot of people of goodwill, not necessarily Jews or Palestinians, are just so uncomfortable. There's such heaviness in people's hearts. And the narrative that they've been fed, not just from the Jewish community or the official Jewish community, but also by the media, by the governments. You know, the same media that brought us the Vietnam War and lied about it for years. And the same media that brought us the weapons of mass destruction now brings us Israel's right to defend itself. The shock, the gap between the narrative and reality. And then Naomi quotes Hannah Arendt, the great Jewish intellectual, who says that the difficulty of making present to my mind the standpoints of those who are absent, the utter inability of most people for 1 second to put themselves into the mindset of Palestinians. This rabbi I was talking to yesterday, he said, how come after 3 generations they're still talking about refugees? Unbelievable. Meanwhile, he talks about the Jews after 2,000 years being exiles. I mean, the disconnect, the dissociation is, let alone the hypocrisy, is utterly unfathomable. Naomi quotes Philip Roth, the author, as saying, it's too ridiculous to take seriously and too serious to be ridiculous.
The great prophet.
No, sorry?
I said the great prophet.
Yeah. Now, when Simone is told, or when Naomi is told, or I'm told, that us as Jews speaking out against Israeli, I don't want to call it policy. No. I want to call it, it's not just a policy. Genocide. It's a whole ideology. It's a whole historical aggression. It's not just a policy. But when we speak out against it, they're telling us, you're promoting anti-Semitism. Well, that's too ridiculous to be taken seriously. Because I'm saying to these people, what's between your ears? The whole world is watching Palestinian children having to have amputations without anesthetic on kitchen tables. That's the reality. And all the Jewish leaders are supporting it in the name of the Jewish people. Well, how does that look to non-Jews of goodwill? And what do you think promotes anti-Semitism? You and the state of the Jews doing this in our name, or Jews actually speaking out against it? It's too serious. But unfortunately, it's also too serious to be ridiculous. It's criminal is what it actually is. It's criminal. These polite conversations about Israel, actually, what's actually going on is mass murder. And how do you have polite conversations about mass murder? How do you have it? But that's what we have to do, isn't it? Naomi furthermore quotes a friend of hers who was one of the founders of Jewish Voices for Peace, Cicely Seresky, who, in Israel right now, Simone was telling me tonight over dinner, and you read about this in the Israeli press, they don't show any pictures of Gaza. They show pictures of Israeli soldiers, but they don't show what's happening to the Palestinians. What they show, night after night after night, is pictures of October the 7th and the victims of October the 7th. And they were victims, they were genuine victims. It's like trauma pornography is what it is. And Cecily said, and keep talking about Jewish trauma, you know, the Holocaust and all that Jews have suffered, but we've never healed that trauma. We've sublimated it. We've, as Naomi points out in her book, we've created the opposite, the tough, muscular, tanned Israeli soldier who rides roughshod over 12-year-old children. Of the hostages, or in this conversation yesterday, the so-called neutral moderator, you can watch this on YouTube, was asking about the hostages. Well, what about the thousands of Palestinian hostages tortured in Israeli jails? I was there last year. I worked with some of them. Amongst the Israeli prisoners, I should say, the Palestinian prisoners exchanged for the hostages, the majority were between 12 and 17 years of age. And these kids get beaten in Israeli jails. You know what their crime is? Their crime is painting as anti-occupation graffiti, throwing stones at an Israeli tank, posting anti-occupation messages on the internet. They get arrested for it and taken for jail. Well, as Cecily Sureski said, it's re-traumatization, not remembering. There's a difference. We keep wallowing in our trauma in order not to have to recognize the trauma that we've inflicted on another people, and we continue to. And finally, Naomi says something that is not just applicable to Israel and Jews and this particular conflict, it's true in general. Because we live in the Western world. Now, the Western world has got a long history of colonialism. You know, the Belgians killed 10 or 12 million Africans about 120 years ago. In a few years. Did you ever read about that in your schools? Did you know that after the Second World War, the Dutch killed nearly 300,000 Indonesians in an attempt to hold on to their colonies? Anybody ever teach you that? Anybody ever teach you that in the 1990s? Raise your hand if you've heard about this, and this is probably a progressive audience. But have you heard that in the 1990s, 100,000 Guatemalan indigenous people were massacred by the army that was trained by the Israeli army? Raise your hand if you knew about that. Even in this audience, it's a minority. These are the things we never talk about. If you went to school in Canada, raise your hand if anybody ever told you when you were in school that here in this province, in the 1960s, an indigenous child, if they spoke their native tongue, they could have a pin stuck in their tongue. Raise your hand if they told you that in school. In school, did they tell you that? Very few. So we live in a world where the attitude and the denial of the colonialist is dominant. And so naturally, Israel's colonization of Palestine is just taken for granted. It's not a crime, it's just the way it needs to be. And so Naomi says very articulately, a version of the same poisonous deal. All who are relatively fortunate on this partition planet are being offered. Take the gun, accept the cages, fortress your escape pod and your borders, perfect your kids, protect your brand, ignore the shadowlands, play the victim. The reason the media and the politicians protect Israel so much, because it fits in so well with this privileged, colonialist, globalist mindset. So we're not just up against the official Jewish leadership, the Jewish trauma vortex that a lot of people are still totally caught in. We're also up against a system that is much larger than this particular issue. And so that in challenging this narrative, we also have to challenge the narrative and the colonization of our own minds. Thank you.
Well, I said I didn't want to go first, but now I'm like, how do I go after that? I first wanted to just thank IJV and the incredible group of organizers who just threw together 5 screenings here this week and brought us out, and it's just, yeah. I'm going to tell a story. I've been thinking a lot about where I was at this time last year, because a year ago is the last time that I was in Palestine, in Israel. And I've been thinking a lot about what it was like there a year ago. I went and I sat with an Israeli friend who's a radical left activist in Tel Aviv, and she took me to her favorite new coffee shop, which is built alongside what used to be the train tracks to Damascus. And it's now this beautiful open walkway where people walk with their strollers and their dogs. And we had a really nice cappuccino. And she told me that at these new democracy protests, where hundreds of thousands of Israelis were going out and protesting against the dismantling of the Israeli Supreme Court, to protect their democracy, of course, that there was this fight about if activists should be bringing Palestinian flags. Of course, very quickly, the Israeli police actually banned it. So this then became a criminal act to bring a Palestinian flag to one of these protests. And, you know, she showed me there's a new train station. The Tel Aviv's new light rail was about to open. All looked very nice. And then I went and visited some friends and colleagues in Ramallah, where they were seeing the news about these Israeli democracy protests, but they were a bit consumed by death. Every single day in the West Bank last year, the Israeli military shot someone. And while I was there visiting, everyday life was usually shut down, often shut down. The army, there were certain days where, you know, there was a massacre in Nablus, there was the pogrom in Hawara. Yeah. And these things, you know, barely make the news 20, whatever, an hour drive away. And that, I remember thinking how badly I wish that my friends in Ramallah could sit in those coffee shops with me in Tel Aviv, and how stark it was that the reality of that place is built so that the people, the indigenous people of that land, cannot actually participate and benefit from the society that has been built on the ruins of their villages. Now, that reality is what a normal day under Israeli apartheid looked like. before October 7th. Now, here we are in a new reality, one that is far more horrific and scary. But I've been thinking a lot about just for me, as you just saw in this film, I come from a community where the reality of Israeli apartheid is, at best, something that people can conveniently look away from. At worst, it's something that's very actively, systematically denied and even in some parts celebrated. And since October 7th, what has just become very present for me is, as I've been, it literally manifests like on my social media feed, right? It's like two sides of my screen. On one side of my feed, my people in the Jewish community that I grew up in and Jewish Israelis who have long been in denial of the reality around them literally still cannot understand the reality that they see, that they are now living through. History started for them on October 7th. They were living in a normal country before October 7th, and now that sense of safety and normalcy is completely shattered. And as Gabor said, there are so many people who are actually having a moment of like, hold on a second, something's not right here. Those of us on social media, it's almost impossible to avoid the just horrific images coming out of Gaza. If you know even one person who's putting it on your feed, breaking into your reality. I guess what I want to say to all of you who came out to see this film, and those of you maybe, I hope in the audience there are people who maybe are having these conversations for the first time, are having these conversations in your communities, maybe have people in your life who are, asking hard questions for the first time as they're horrified and heartbroken. And what I don't feel that my story is, I don't think that I'm special. I think that this film is about telling the story of something, first of all, that it is a story that tens, hundreds of thousands of Jews around the world have undergone. I'm feeling beyond honored to be sitting on a stage with two people who underwent that process when it was much harder than it was for me. And to be in that lineage. And for me, as you said, this is not necessarily something that is a uniquely Jewish story. There's a big spotlight on Jews right now to be asking hard questions about the oppression that we are part of. Of course, Jews are not the only ones who are complicit in horrible systems of oppression. And so I also hope that there's a way that people watching this film can see in it a very universal message of what does it mean to ask hard questions, to allow yourself to be transformed by heartbreak and by grief at witnessing such unspeakable oppression and violence, and to take the very basic step of like allowing yourself to be shattered and reconstituted by stepping towards a different vision of truth.
So thank you to all of our panelists. That was moving and profound, and I'm sure it will stay with you as it's going to stay with me for weeks. We're going to move into the Q&A session, but in a cheeky move, I might ask the first question on behalf of Independent Jewish Voices, and then we'll open it up to the floor. I think we're going to take two other questions after I ask mine, and then we'll go to the panelists to respond. Does that sound okay? Okay. So obviously, this film is mostly centered around the United States, and we're in a different nation state right now, regardless of what we might think of that nation state. In 2002, pro-Palestine students successfully shut down a talk by Benjamin Netanyahu at Concordia University.
And my son was a part of that. There's a film you can watch, an NFB film called Discordia, about that particular incident. Yeah.
So this was a huge game changer, and a lot of Jews in this country from the establishment were completely upended by the fact that this could happen. And so Heather Reisman and Jerry Schwartz, who we might know, the owners and founders, CEOs of Indigo Books. Can I get a shame? So they created what they called the Israel Emergency Cabinet, which their task was to transform Canadian Jewish institutions into pro-Israel advocacy organizations. And in a way that was described by many Jews as a coup within the Jewish community, the Israel Emergency Cabinet managed to replace the 90-year-old Canadian Jewish Congress in 2011 with their own organization called the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, which still exists to this day. Can I get a shame? My question for the panelists tonight, how do we as Jews separate Israel from Jewish affairs?
Well, I'm Jewish and I used to have affairs, but I'm not, sorry.
Here all night.
Well, that's not for us to answer. The question is, why the hell are they confused in the first place? You know, when there's this place called the Jewish Community Center, but I don't call it, I go swimming there, you know, and 2 months ago I was just parking my bicycle to go for, outside, and this woman comes up to me and says, "Are you?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And she said, "Well, what are you doing in the Jewish Community Center?" I said, "I'm swimming." "Well, do you know that a lot of people are uncomfortable? In fact, they hate your guts, you know?" I said, "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that." "No, you're not. When you go in the Jewish Community Center, you see Israeli flags." So, and many years ago, there used to be an organization called Jews for a Just Peace. It was really a huge organization of about 10 people here in Vancouver. And we had some events. Now, one of the events that we held was we invited, many of you have seen videos by Miko Peled, have you? Miko Peled wrote a book called General's Son. His father, Mati Peled, was a member of the Israeli General Staff in 1967. And his mother's Nuit Peled. His sister, I think, was killed in a terrorist suicide bomb. And Miko is a powerful speaker on behalf of Palestinian rights. And he's got very clear on the meaning of Zionism. He comes from really high-class Zionist stock, you might say. Now, his father, after he retired from the military, this is before Israel spoke to the PLO, because Yitzhak Shamir, who was a terrorist who murdered hundreds of Arabs, and Menachem Begin, another terrorist, another prime minister of Israel, also responsible for many, many children and women being killed in 1948, they said, "We don't negotiate with terrorists." By the way, there was a wonderful cartoon the other day. Joe Biden says, "We don't negotiate with terrorists, we fund them." In any case, Mati Peled came out for negotiating with the Palestinians. The Jewish Community Center would not allow him to speak there because it threatens Israel's security. The Jewish Community Center in Vancouver knew much better how to protect Israel's security than an Israeli general. So this conflation between Jewishness and Zionism, we don't have to separate it. It's just reality. The two have nothing to do with each other.
We just need to build our own swimming pools.
Jews have, sorry?
I said we need to build our own swimming pools.
Yeah. they're the ones who should explain why they confused the two. You know, there were Jews all along, since the beginning of the Zionist movement, who opposed Zionism. One of my great heroes, unfortunately, many of them were murdered by the Nazi Holocaust. They were. There was I'll finish talking in a moment. There was one of my heroes is a man called, is a man called Marek Edelman. Marek Edelman was the second in command of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Now, you may not know this, but the PLO resistance actually idolized the fighters of the Warsaw Ghetto. And Marek Edelman was the only surviving leader of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. He escaped under the sewers and joined the Polish resistance against the Nazis. And after the war, he became a cardiologist, and it was always a very principled stand for justice. He stood against the communist government's suppression of the labor movement, and he was a lifelong supporter of Palestinian resistance and rights. He criticized them for the anti-civilian terrorism, but he actually said that they are the ghetto fighters of today. So we're not the ones who should say, how do we separate the two? They should explain why the two should be conflated. That's my point of view.
So, listening to this resurfacing of other ways of relating to Judaism, I think this is going on in many quarters, and this is one of the things that I find most hopeful about this generational shift that's going on, is that when I got involved in Palestinian solidarity activism in the 90s during the first Intifada, it was like those groups of 10 people. It was Jews against the occupation, then it was Jews against apartheid, but it was only oppositional. It was only oppositional, and I think that we have to continue to oppose genocide, but we also have a right to be Jewish in our own ways. And that is the biggest thing that I see shifting in these new, this intergenerational shift, is that it's not apologetic, it's not just oppositional, it's confident in its identity, and part of the confidence comes from relinking with the many ways of being Jewish that predates the creation of the State of Israel. One of the things that I explore in Doppelganger, which Gabor was very kindly citing, has to do with this exploration of the many different ways of being Jewish and the way Zionism kind of ended the conversation, but specifically the way the Holocaust ended the conversation. Because, as Gabor was saying, many of the people who believed in liberation through a socialist utopia, or the Labor Bund, who believed in protecting Jewish culture within a working class movement, they were destroyed in the Holocaust or in Stalin's camps. And so it was Zionism won by default. It's not like it won the argument and people were like, yeah, that's actually how to keep Jews safe. It's that the whole field of debate was wiped out by different kinds of genocide. And so it was in response to the horrors of the Nazi Holocaust that political Zionists were able to claim, in this very pessimistic way, that I think is rightfully understood as a kind of Judeo-pessimism, that the only thing you can do in the face of Jew hatred, which is presented as totally outside of history and primordial and just a pure evil force that you can't understand in connection to any other force, is just put a gun to its head and force it into submission, right? And build the walls that we saw in the film. I was so struck by Simone describing going to Bethlehem just surrounded by walls. And what the Israeli government is now trying to do is exponentially increasing precisely the model that failed on October the 7th, right? Many more walls, a buffer zone in Gaza. Like it's doubling down is not enough, just an exponential increase of the idea of a fortress state that has completely failed and will not make anyone safe. But what I want to come back to is this, this pessimistic idea that the Holocaust proves that that is the only way to keep Jews safe. I think it is an answer to the wrong question. The real question is, how did the Nazis rise in the first place?
Yeah.
Because once fascism gets its hooks in and it's making some real progress, nobody's safe. Nobody is safe. Once that force is unleashed, nobody is safe. So we have to figure out how we fight them. And we fight them together, right? And every history of far-right victory is also a history of left-wing and progressive splintering and division and successful pitting of working classes against one another, often using race and ethnicity. So, Gabor was talking about the dismemberment and the re-traumatization. So what would it mean to remember, right? To put ourselves back together. And I don't think we do it just as Jews. I think we do it in solidarity with everybody who is othered, and we stop exceptionalizing our story, right? When Simone was talking, I was just remembering this remarkable quote, and I'll just share this from my friend Molly Crabapple, who's writing a book about the Labor Bund. She just recently translated this quote from Heinrich Ehrlich. She taught herself Yiddish to write this book. He was leader of the Bund in Poland in 1933. And he said, "One of our greatest sins in the eyes of the Jewish bourgeoisie has been that in the course of the 35 years of our existence as a party, we have not ceased to defend the simple idea that we Jews are not a chosen people, neither in the positive nor in the negative sense, but a people just like any other nation, and that even through our history and our social economic circumstances of our lives are unique, the same rules apply to us that regulate the lives of all other nations in the world." I think that might be how we get free.
Thank you. Simone, did you want to make a comment, or should we go to questions?
We can go to questions.
Okay. Sorry to intervene there. So we, I think, have two people, who are going to help with moderation. I don't know if you want to, since you both have mics, just say your names, and then, we'll take the questions.
I'm Sasha.
And I'm Ria. But I think we already have our first question ready.
Sounds good. Hello, my name is Omar. I'm here with my younger brother. We are both Mexican and Palestinian. My grandfather was born in Gaza in the 1920s. That is the only preface I'll give. I'd like to say, Gabor, you're a champion. You are very humble man, but I genuinely think you're a champion. And behind a champion, there's always a very strong woman carrying that champion. So I would like to thank you and your wife. I would personally like to extend the thank you to your daughter Hannah, to Aaron and Daniel for their great work. And you are my hero, Gabor, to be honest. And I've been reading so many of your books, and I have pursued such a wonderful path towards enlightening myself with a lot of your wisdom. My main question, I'll get to it, is how would you connect your previous statement, or rather a phrase that you were told, that Palestinian children do not experience PTSD because the trauma is never post, and connecting that to the intergenerational trauma that has been experienced on this indigenous land? Thank you.
In 2005, there was this article in the World Journal of Psychiatry about war trauma around the world and the impact of war trauma on children. And the highest percentages of trauma were in Gaza and Palestine. Children having nightmares, children wetting their beds, children acting aggressively, children having behavior issues. That was in 2005. And since then, there's been a series of massacres of Palestinians, especially in Gaza, but of course ongoing in the West Bank as well. One of the founders of Hamas, who was subsequently assassinated by the Israelis, was a pediatrician who was 8 years old in 1956 when he watched his uncle being killed during a mass execution of Palestinian boys and men by the Israeli army, unarmed. And he said, "They planted hatred in my heart." Since 2005, it's only got a lot worse, and I don't have to tell you what's going on right now. Now, the young men who streamed into Israel, and by the way, Hamas today or yesterday gave an explanation of why they did what they did, without justifying the killings of civilians. But their rationale wasn't to go out there and kill a whole lot of Jews. Their intention was to seize hostages, to exchange for their prisoners. I don't say they had the right to seize civilians. To strike a blow against the Israeli army, which they did brilliantly, and to wake the world up, which has been ignoring their plight for all these decades. And Saudi Arabia was about to sign a sweetheart deal with Israel that once more bypassed the Palestinians. So I'd say as political aims, those were very legitimate aims. But the young men who streamed into Israel that day, who were they? They were those traumatized children grown up. Are we surprised that some of them might have committed some crimes? Not to justify anything, but we want to understand something. Now, what do we expect to happen in this generation that's witnessing there's 30,000 or 18,000, the last time I saw the figures, there was something like 18,000 or 20,000 orphans in Gaza. And when you look at that study in 2005, it had to do with watching their parents being beaten and humiliated, themselves being beaten, bombings, killings, insecurity. Well, this is happening on an exponential scale right now. What do we have to look forward to in terms of traumatization? It's going to be horrendous. And traumatized people are more likely to, and especially if they're trauma, I mean, just for a moment, imagine what Jews would be feeling if the whole world denies the Holocaust. Who said, this never happened. Or if it did happen, it was your own damn fault. Which is pretty much what the official media, singing the Israeli chorus, is telling the Palestinians. Now, Jews still haven't healed the trauma of the Holocaust. You see that coming up in their response to what's happening in Palestine. You know, more Jews have been killed in one day than any time since the Holocaust. As if those people were killed because they were Jewish. As somebody said, if they'd been elephants or dinosaurs or Dutch or English, but doing what the Israelis did to the Palestinians, they would have been killed. Nothing to do with being Jewish. But in the traumatized mind, those distinctions don't exist. That the past completely defines the present. What kind of present are these Palestinian kids going to have? Israel knows that very, very well. And that's why they're thinking of getting rid of all of them from Gaza. If they could, they would. If they don't, it's only because the world won't let them. 52% of Israelis right now believe that Gaza should be settled by Jews again. And those 21 Israeli soldiers that died there yesterday, Naomi mentioned it. What Israel is doing now is building a buffer zone between Gaza and Israel. And what they're doing is demolishing a building yesterday. If they haven't bombed enough buildings into oblivion, yesterday they were demolishing a building and some Hamas fighters shot at them and they were blown up by their own explosives. So Israel knows this very well. So Israel may think it can get away by building a buffer zone, by expelling the Palestinians. But those Palestinians that survive, they'll be severely traumatized and, for reasons we can understand, possibly very much driven towards hatred again. And my own surprise, and maybe Naomi's as well, what's your name? Simone. Sorry. I'm getting old. Simone's is not that some Palestinians would hate us, but how many of them don't hate us at all. That's the big surprise. But the future doesn't look good for mental health, for physical health, or for politics. That's how I see it.
Simone or Naomi? You both are going to wait till next? Okay, could we actually do 2 questions and then we'll get some responses, just to get more people.
Hi, thank you for the talk and thank you for the movie. I guess my question kind of centers around the dialogues we have moving forward. A lot of the conflict leading up to now, and especially in the past 100 and so days, has been framed in the negative sense. We're critiquing the Israeli government, we're critiquing the IOF. Moving forward, whether it's to heal or to educate ourselves, how important is it to look at the positive sense in the way the movie did and kind of center it around the Palestinian people? One of the lines that really is poignant from the movie was the land without a people without a land for a land without a people, and how when you kind of talk about the culture, talk about the history of the Palestinian people, you show that before 1948 it was rich and vibrant. So in that sense, moving forward, talking about how we can, whether it's educating ourselves, people, educating others, how important is it to center the Palestinian people and culture in that dialogue?
Okay, and second question.
I hate to pose a what is to be done in this sort of situation, but...
Can we actually get a woman or someone who's not male identified? I'm not sure what your identity is.
Yeah, no, sure. Fair enough.
Yeah.
I'll happily pass the mic on.
I just want to, we only have so many questions. My apologies.
Sorry, I feel like I just stole the mic from someone. But so this is a bit of a weird question for me because I've always considered myself to be an anarchist, but it's about electoral politics. And so it was kind of directed at Naomi and Simone. We're facing an election cycle where in Canada we're looking at Pierre Poilievre, who is essentially Donald Trump. And in the US, of course, you're looking at Donald Trump. How do we organize right now when so many of us are completely disenfranchised with the Liberal government and with Biden in the US over their stance on Israel-Palestine? And when the option potentially plunges us into the white supremacy that gave rise to the current conflict. So how do we organize right now around the rise of the right converging in this time? Thanks.
Maybe we'll start off.
Yeah, I'll start. I wanted to answer the first question first, but there's something that kind of connects both of them for me, which is Okay, I'm going to tell a little story about the U.S., but it's irrelevant. So we just had, I'm sure many of you have seen this ridiculous theater in Congress where the heads of the 3 elite universities were brought in for questioning by a white supremacist senator. And the woman, she's a Republican, I actually don't know if she's a congresswoman or a senator, but whatever. She opened up the hearing by talking about, she literally said she went after Senator Chuck Schumer, who had just spoken out against anti-Semitism, and she chastised him for not being very explicit about what the source of anti-Semitism was. The university. She literally said that. And she then proceeded to list examples of courses that teach anti-Semitism, I think at Harvard, or at the list of schools that she was going after. And they were literally just classes about racism and colonialism. Like literally nothing to do with Jews, nothing to do with Israel-Palestine. And it's so stark that like how explicitly these movements are actually, how clear they are about the fact that they're using anti-Semitism and they're using Jews as part of this wider authoritarian effort to just dismantle public universities and private universities, the teaching of any critical history, and you know, that as a part of this broader effort to, you know, attack all of our safety and well-being and histories and communities. So that's, I mean, so I think for me, there's obvious, to answer the first question, I mean, it feels essential to me. You know, part of what is very meaningful to me about this film is that it's also a tool. It's both of, it's doing two things at once, right? It's like giving people a blueprint for unlearning and for crossing a bridge towards a deeper understanding and critical engagement with reality. And then at the same time, it's also about giving voice to these people who, and their stories and their histories and their lived experiences, and also trying to put that in the center at the same time. So I feel like doing both of those things at the same time always feels really essential. And I think it's also kind of part of like what it means to try to imagine something more hopeful for the future, is that it's through telling these histories, through history, art, writing, culture, that there is something for us to hold on to that gives us a blueprint for what we want. So I'll let you actually say something about the electoral part of it. Because I don't know about that part.
Yeah, I mean, when I think there is a need for a lot of different kinds of stories, and I think that I think the beauty of this film in this moment is that I think a lot of people are looking for a kind of off-ramp from this ideology that is so treacherous and violent. And it's a story, you know, and that's the strength of the film, is that it shows what it's like to grow up inside the story, and it shows what it's like to change the story. And like I said at the start, I think that is, we need examples of that. We need examples of seeing people change their mind. But then what the next story is, that's a story that that, of course, is not just, diaspora Jews to tell. And there are many, there's the story that we're going to tell here. There's the story that they're going to tell there, from the river to the sea. I think that we can be clear about standing for principles. And, one thing I find myself thinking about is, coming back to the first question about trauma. I mean, that is going to reverberate through the generations. It doesn't get magicked away, There isn't a fix. There isn't a solution. But what we do know is that there are examples of tremendous horror producing change. And from the fires of the Holocaust, there was a fork in the road in that moment, right? There was the never again for anyone, right? There was the horror of, we, the world, let this happen. And out of that horror was born the entire architecture of international humanitarian law that Israel is violating so systematically before our eyes, including the 1948 Geneva Convention. 1948, the same year as the State of Israel was created by the same institution that passed the Universal Declaration for Human Rights in 1948 also. So all of these key commitments, except there was an asterisk next to them. They said, except for we're just going to create this one ethno-state over here because we're going to exceptionalize this particular form of hatred, and we're going to pass the mantle of whiteness to the Jews who get to do settler colonialism as a twisted form of reparations for genocide. So no, you actually have to choose, it turns out. You have to go all in. You have to go all in for the universal principles of equality and justice and liberation. And we have one more day, folks, until we know what the verdict is in The Hague. Tomorrow is the last day before we know whether South Africa's extraordinary case, extraordinary for all the historical reasons of thinking about the fact that it was South Africa bringing the case, itself a product of an incredible liberation movement. And I don't know what's going to happen Friday morning when we wake up. The decision will already be made. But it's going to be I know it's going to be a really important day for all of us to decide what principles we want to govern our relationships. We don't have that much control over how our relationships are going to be what's going to happen there. But we have some control over how we're going to behave here, how we're going to treat each other here. And it's a dialectic, right? The argument for Zionism is that Jews can't be safe here. They need the fortress state. So if we have left movements that don't take anti-Semitism seriously, if we aren't fighting anti-Semitism here and we're sort of we're offloading it to the CIJA and saying, okay, this is the one ism we don't have to care about, that's a gift to them because actually it feeds Zionism. We have to have a model where everybody is safe, right? We have to build those bridges between our liberation movements, at least here. And that's part of how we fight the far right. This is the hardest election of my lifetime in order to provide this advice. I will not sit here and say it doesn't matter. It can always get worse. I'm sorry, that's part of the moral of the story, okay? I'm going to quote my late friend Howard Zinn, who in another tough election, when both the Democrats and the Republicans supported a horrific war in Iraq and Afghanistan after 9/11, he said, think about it for the 2 minutes you're in the voting booth, and the rest of the time build the movements that we need. Don't get too hung up about it. It's probably going to be obvious when it comes down to it. That decision in the voting booth is not the work of building the counterpower to fascism. That's what we have to do. And then we're all going to have to make our decisions in the voting booth and let it take the 2 minutes that it takes to vote. But let's not confuse that for the politics that we need to build it. I do, yeah.
Okay. So I think on that note, before we all get kicked out of here, we gotta end it. And And yeah, I have a couple words, but yeah, did you want to speak for a second? No?
Can we get a giant round of applause for everyone here? I'm going to take a photo of the standing. The reason I'm taking a photo of the standing applause is because those who are not with us today are the remarkable filmmakers that made this story possible. So I just wanted us to acknowledge the incredible work of Aaron Axelman, who is just a force of nature in every possible way, who will be here at some of the subsequent hearings. Hearings. Everything feels like a tribunal. And also Sam Illertson, am I butchering his name? Daniel Chalfin, Nadia Sa, and so many others who are responsible for this film. This is a 7-year production. It took a very, very, very long time. What you're seeing is a very abbreviated and yet extremely impactful, provocative, and powerful distillation of a remarkable life's work for every single member of this community. As a non-Jew, I hereby say that I am humbled to be in your presence, to be in solidarity with you. I know that these are extremely difficult times, as they are for Palestinians, but also for Jews. And to be able to say what you say today, tomorrow, the coming months, and the years in the future, it's landmark. And for many of us who are here listening to a lot of this stuff for the first time, these are eye-opening moments of rapture. And from moments of rapture comes growth. And I thank you for contributing to not only sowing the seeds, but also watering the soil. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for being here.
And just to take Naomi's words seriously, let's list a few of the organizations that y'all can get involved with if you aren't already. There is, of course, the Palestinian Youth Movement, who are leading us right now in so many ways. There's Samidoun doing really great work in this city. I've really also got to plug Independent Jewish Voices, which we do have a table outside. And then we're there with Students for Justice in Palestine. So make sure to talk with them as well. Yeah, I don't know if there's any final words from you folks before we all get turfed, but...
Well, just one word. I haven't acknowledged Simone. My own awakening happened a few years before, being a few years older than she is, in 1967, when up to that point I was sort of still in the Zionist camp, although I was getting a foot out of it. And then the Vietnam War happened, which woke my eyes up to the reality of this society. But when the war broke out, I still sort of sided with poor Israel, surrounded by all these enemies and all this stuff. And then I began to notice something, that the same press that cheered on and lied about through the teeth every day about the mass murder of Vietnamese by the Americans was so supportive of Israel. And I thought, what's going on here? So then I did the research about that war, and who started it, and what led up to it, and what was the background. That was my awakening. So in October of '67, I wrote an article for the student newspaper at UBC about the war, who started it, and that Israel occupied territories, and I implied that they're never going to give it back. I'm still waiting to be wrong on that one. But there weren't too many, I'm not trying to paint myself as a pioneer here, because long before I was born, there was Jewish voices opposing Zionism. But I was in a tradition. But it was pretty isolating and isolated. And to see now this whole movement that you're a part of and that your movie represents and the impact that you're having, and that there's a whole new generation now that one could imagine would someday happen, but see it actually taking place, the awakening that's happening. It's still in the early stages, but it's so much more advanced. So I just want to extend to you my deep appreciation for your own awakening and for your courage in standing by it. And I know it's cost you. It costs all of us. But even today, it costs you. So here you are with this film and touring throughout North America. And I don't even know that when you made the film, you could even imagine the horrors that are taking place right now. But there's no better time for your message to be put in front of the public as right now. So really my deep acknowledgement to you, Simone. Thank you.
Okay, and with that, we'll just have another round of applause for our guests here, and good night.